everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you, CCA, for hosting us here. We would like to make kind of very dense presentation about Russian, especially Moscow art scene, and how we'd call it like alignment of forces. And Anna would start with more kind of archaeological part, talking about the introduction of market forces and free market and new institutional system in post-Soviet Russia, and how it influenced artistic production. And later, it will take around 30-35 minutes, and then I will tell you mostly about reconfiguration of relationship of art and politics, especially after the protest movement that started in 2011-2012. So that's it.
I would start with the 19th, and I guess going back, it's important to say that the country was in a sort of economical and social chaos. And what is important to keep in mind that one of the problems was an inexistence of institutions. And I guess to understand what I mean by saying an existence institutions or institutional crisis, I will explain to you how art system looked like during Soviet time. So as you can see, there were 4 organizations like Ministry of Culture, Academy of Arts, Union of Artists, Ideological Division of the Central Committee. So as you can imagine, that Ministry of Culture was a head of a food chain, and it was supporting other organizations and was distributing the budget. The Academy of Arts was responsible also for recruiting and training artists, and also supporting them financially and patronizing as well. And Union of Artists was an organization that I would say it's like a trade union or labor union for that also patronizing artists and protect them. Not touch the other division, because it's quite obvious, because it was in a control of artistic outcome. So as you can see that there is so the art system as itself was a sort of a very circulated and unified, and everything else that existed outside was a sort of a refugee, a sort of an outsider, and wasn't included in that process. And we can remember any non-conformistic and alternative initiatives that were existed at that time. So what is interesting about the system is it was reproducing itself all the time, and it was at the same time was a producer, art dealer, and buyer of an artistic outcome. And as I mentioned before, that in the 19th, this system, this circulated system, experienced a deep crisis. So there was sort of a need to facilitate it and to create a new infrastructure. So by saying new infrastructure, I mean that a new educational system, a new union system, a new non-for-profit and also for-profit initiatives that would be adequate and would respond to the cultural, contemporary cultural sphere. So at that time, I would say that the first contemporary art center, National Contemporary Art Center, was founded, and also it was founded by a Hungarian-American businessman, George Soros. He played actually an important role in cultural production, not only in the 19th, but during the first decade of the millennium. And also later he founded a new contemporary art center, which called Soros Contemporary Art Center, but recently it was closed because of lack of funding. Also, first educational initiatives was ICA, Institute for Contemporary Art, that was founded by Josef Bachstein. He's now a commissioner of Moscow Biennale for Contemporary Art. And what about for non-for-profit institutions? As for-profit institutions, there were of course several galleries like Regina Gallery or Trochprudny Land Gallery. So these are two images that were taken in on the right side. There is it was an exhibition. It was a performance that was made by Avdej Tereganan towards the object, in which he got really dead drunk just before the performance, and he slept under the floor like for the rest of the show. So that was his sort of a statement and sort of a reference to Dedi's practice, because Avdej Tereganan is famous for following modernistic trends and modernistic methods. On the right side, it was an exhibition called Day of Knowledge, and it was curated by Oleg Kulik at Regina Gallery in 1981. So you can see the work of Konstantin Zvezdochodov and ITI group, which is actually a literal translation from Russian. So if you translate it in English, it's going to be expropriation of arts territory. And eti, it's a Russian word for these. So artists using that word. So at that time, during the 19th, if you call a group of people these, that would mean that you're really. So this word had really negative connotation. So it's sort of, you express your negative attitude to those people, like these people, like, and. So that's why they use this abbreviation in the name of the group, because they were perceived themselves as a alternative to emergence of a new institutional system. They were totally not against it, but they perceived themselves as in opposition to it, and. And the other work is, one of the members of this group was Anatoly Smolovsky, about whom I'm going to speak a bit later. And he made this installation with the slogans that you can see on the left side. And it was sort of a reference to Soviet slogans that was, of course, an integral part of national propaganda. So instead of using something that would like inspire the whole nation, they used a really offensive, well, not offensive, but really inappropriate in this context words like impotent or shit. And above you can find that's the name of a Soviet boxer. So it's together. It looked like offensive message that was addressed to a new neoliberal government that was led by Boris Yeltsin. So forming these initiatives, because still it's important to keep that in mind, that even though there is a gallery space and there were obviously a commercial space, it was still an experimental area. It's very experimental sphere. It wasn't really functioning in that way. It was more because the whole system was still formulating at that time, and so you can't think of these spaces as something that is really totally commercial or totally not commercial. It always a gray zone. It always something in between. And so if you could just go back? No, go back. Yeah. So thanks. So this environment, this an experimental environment in which all artists were working at that time. Victor Miziano, he's a very well-known Russian art critic and curator, and he introduced this term tusovka, which is a Russian word for informal community, informal collaboration. And what he meant by that term is that since the old system was old institutional system wasn't in crisis, the new system hadn't had a chance to establish itself. So it was his way to describe in this idea how agents, how like artists, curators, critics, and other cultural workers were trying to establish new institutional system without having any experience of it. So by creating this very informal relationship, it was a sort of a way to find maybe a perfect model for future establishment of the institutional system. So at that time, well, the literal translation would be, I guess, is just when you're hanging out with people who share your ideas and who think alike, or to just with whom you feel like, you know, like you're among people who share your ideas. But also, it is important to say, I guess, that if you're talking about Yeltsin time, which is quite important in terms of that, of course, the reformation of economic system, and a sort of a positive consequences of that would be emergence of a free market. And at that time, that would mean that the commercial sector had a chance to develop and integrate, in our case, Russian artists into global art scene and to a global context. But although, of course, there was an opportunity, but also when it happened, especially those freshly established non-profit and for-profit institutions, they realized a certain problem, that the dialogue between East and West at that time had a really specific character. And Ekaterina Doggett, she's also well-known Russian art critic and curator and art historian, she said that from the Western system, from the Western perspective, with its kind of multicultural attitude, multicultural approach, Russian artists, they were seen as a source, or as a people that would that would speak about their new national identity and would reflect on their context in which they all were living. And And on the one hand, of course, it was a moment of struggle for not only for Russian artists, but also for like the whole community, because it was also a moment of trauma, a moment of frustration of losing something that been for such a long time, and like living in this sort of a strict system and with its precise worldview, and all of a sudden you just woke up one day and realized that you're in another country. And on the one hand, like from the artistic perspective, of course, on the one hand it was a struggle not only with actually being self-reflective about this context, but also to a sort of a desire to be accepted within Western context. But of course, so being in this in-between situation, I guess this work actually really illustrates this point of view really really accurate, because it's a performance of Oleg Kulik, Mad Dog performance that he did in 1994, and as you can see that he's totally naked, wearing a leash with a chain, and he was barking at the crowd and trying to attack them. So he was creating this image of wild, unpredictable Russia for that how West or like global art scene perceived Russia in general, and particularly Russian artists as well. Something that is unknown, something that is something that is quite hard to define or to complicated to. This was, I guess, is Amsterdam, and. Yeah, so something to which something that is quite hard to not to distinguish, but also to find a way to respond to. And so during that time and during this frustration and during this, I guess, keeping that in mind, this idea of finding a new national idea or a new national idea of the state was surprisingly this sort of a westernized multicultural approach corresponded with the desire or governmental need to form a new identity of the state and the new idea that would associate with Russia. And that was another part of a neoliberal program that was obviously promoted and also advertised by the government and then supported. And so when I was talking about Regina Gallery and the project Day of Knowledge, I mentioned Anatoly Smolovsky, and he was one of the members of the ETI group. And so he's well known for this, to establish this kind of paradoxical critical discourse that was also relevant for most artistic production in Russia. And also on the one hand, he was trying to kind of point out this institutional collapse, and also supported this idea to not to find a way to use modernistic methods in a new context, but also to using this modernistic position in order to reestablish the autonomy, the arts autonomy, as institutional critique, as a way to find their own artistic autonomy beyond this neoliberal system, beyond this neoliberal, badly established institutions. And also one of the way to criticize this institutional situation and institutional crisis was also to organize, to form an independent and alternative ways of educational initiatives. For instance, schools or workshops or studios, and for instance, Avdej Teraganan, that I've shown you before, the one that was lying on the floor. He founded School of Contemporary Art, and the idea of the school was to dissolve the hierarchy between student and professor, which was really current at that time at Academy of Arts. And for him, it was important to form a collective where all voices would be heard. This school also was really important because after that, the huge generation of new young artists emerged, like his son David Teraganan, Valery Chtak, and Alexander Buldakov, which later became members of Radek community. And this work and this performance, which called Muselim, was really, it's a good illustration of what artistic community felt about new political regime, especially, in our case, neoliberal regime. So basically what they did, they occupied Lenin's mausoleum for a very short period of time, and they put this sign against everybody by saying that they're against everybody, against particularly, because they did that performance shortly after parliamentarian elections, where of course Yeltsin's party won, and they were expressing their not Yeltsin. I mean that at that time he was almost dead. So I mean at that time there was Putin's. Sorry. So, but I mean you get the idea. Like there's no a big difference. So and I guess my next step would be to go to 2000, and with, I guess, next decade would be marked by sort of economical and social stabilization of the country, and the further development of this widely organized infrastructure and further demystification, I would say it. So this idea of tusovka that I mentioned earlier, the idea of informal community and the idea of where individual needs are prioritized most of the time, this approach switched to the professionalization, I would say, and even corporatization of the art field. And in this case, that would mean that the beginning of cultural that would mean the beginning of cultural industry for Russia. Even though, of course, cultural industry here, using this term, is really. I'm trying to use it really carefully because, of course, it's not the same cultural industry as as it in US or in European countries. So, but the thing is that 2000 was the the main idea that marked the first decade of the millennium was, I guess, to create the desire to create an analog of European system, of European cultural institutions, and especially so one of the attempts was to establish Moscow Museum of Modern Art and Moscow Biennials and further art schools and art prizes and art fairs. And also what is important is that private money became more, I would say that private money of oligarchs invested in cultural production as well. So that the foundation of different private initiatives was also affected the art landscape, of contemporary art landscape. In what way? So I guess when we're talking about private foundations, is what is important to keep in mind that they monopolized actually the whole production nowadays, because since there are not many options that you can use if you're an artist and you want to study abroad or to interact with the international context or global context. So actually foundations are gonna be your last chance, and because they're only organizations that would support artists, that would provide that would send artists that would allow them participate in international programs and to attempt different international and to send them abroad, basically. Also about art schools, the educational system, and nowadays of course I'm talking about particularly Moscow, but still there are only 2 schools that actually train and teach in different, in a contemporary art field. So this is, the first school is ICA that was founded in 1991, and the other one was Rodchenko School, which was founded in 2006, and it specializes in photography and media art. But still, if we're talking about the quality of that, the quality of their educational system is still not, it's still far from European level. It's still very, not studio-based, but still very limited. But so talking about the formation of cultural industry, it's quite important to say that, of course, there was not all people were happy about it, and of course, having this experience of Tusovka that was during 19th made artists, especially young generation of artists, to feel nostalgic about it at some point. And this is the project that was made by Anastasia Rebova. So she began actually to create a website on which she posted. Uploaded different photos of an artworks that she found in artist homes or studios. So basically, in order to create this website, she interviewed as much as she could artists from different generations, and she collected, photographed all works that they had in their studios, whether or at homes. And she created, so she was exploring the relationship between the art object and the owner. So basically, at the bottom you can see that the different tags like stolen, found, given as a present, bought, forgotten, stored, left off, and it's in Russian, but inherited. So basically, this is how those artists got those works. Either they were stolen, either they were bought, or given as a present. So by highlighting those relationships, it was sort of a critique of this emerging cultural industry, where there is a sort of a subordination of a professional relationship to which corporate logic, I guess, follows most of the time. And here, that it was a sort of a reference. This project was a reference to that idea of Tusovka, where there is no such relationship, or there is no, you don't have to follow this subordination of professional ethics. And so that project was presented for the first time at Modernicorn exhibition in Turin in 2010. So she made this, so she actually visualized it so she made this a really huge image of how those works actually came, who owns, and how. And so she was trying to visualize all those relationships that she highlighted. And with this, what this sort of institutional critique approach, I guess, and also with the idea that there is a neoliberal institutions with a corporate logic, and on the other hand, there is a group of cultural workers that still believes that cultural production should follow other ways, should be developed maybe beyond logic of global market or market at all, or to be commercialized at any sense. So in 2009, a group of cultural workers, they organized this May Congress of Cultural Workers group, and the idea was that's the website. Unfortunately, it's not bilingual, so it's only in Russian. But so the idea was to create an organization that would protect cultural workers from being exploited by cultural I don't know, corporated neoliberal institutions, because most of the time actually it's really accurate, because a lot of over experienced or over trained workers had to do or have to do a very underpaid, have to occupy very underpaid positions. So actually this group is fighting for this idea to establish an institution, a union basically, that would protect cultural workers for being exploited. And but unfortunately, for now they didn't manage to find a budget or funding. But as far as I can recently I read on their website that they're now kind of relaunching to, they're trying to find another way to relaunch this project, and maybe in the future they will be able to organize something that would be that you could call a union of cultural workers. So, and I guess you could...
Yeah, just the next artist, do you hear me? Do you hear me? Yeah, the next artist I would like to talk about actually is staying just on the left in these glasses. So before I start, I just want to say very briefly about the protest movement that emerged in Russia because of election fraud in 2011 in December. That lead to like whole refiguration of the whole relationship between art and politics and art and activism, and it's very interesting that some people, they started like to claim publicly in the press that if we go to protest, we are not artists anymore. If we come back home, we are artists and we continue to make like our artworks. Or some curators, aforementioned curator Ekaterina Dogut, for example, wrote that artists don't want anymore curators that kind of create this exhibition, kind of selecting artists for his or her idea, but curator becomes a kind of comrade or brother in arms, or like sister in arms, who fight together with other artists for the same idea. And just to continue the line that Anna started, this was project made in the Tretyakov Gallery, the kind of main gallery in Moscow that represent 19th century art and 20th century art. It's called Museum of Proletarian Culture. That was organized by artist Arseny Zhelaev. And actually his idea was based on experimental Marxist exhibition that was curated. There was no word curator in 1931 by Fyodorov Davidov, who was at that time, like before Stalinist backlash, he was against any kind of linear idea of history, kind of written from this kind of bourgeois position. But he was claiming for art history based on like Marxist dialectics and this kind of class dialectics and historical materialism that was encapsulated in this rearrangement of the kind of traditional exposition. So it actually took place in the same gallery in 31 and 2012. And he started like the exhibition including some works from the 20s from the exhibition display that were not on display. Sorry, it's like from catalog. It's not like that in real life. So, for example, some painting representing like doctors or teachers or builders that create kind of new socialist societies. And very important to understand that his museum not only criticizing these neoliberal museums, but also kind of make a critique of old socialist bureaucratic institutions that has all this avant-garde art, but because of all this bureaucracy and because now curators and philosophers and art historians who work there have to become kind of managers and they actually fail to do that, it kind of lose its kind of radical potential, but it still has it. So he tried to also radicalize this radical potential of all old museums and include some histories that were repressed or oppressed, for example, some naive art and some amateur art, as you can see here. And he also created some fictional characters. Slow down, sorry. Some fictional characters like this one. This person doesn't exist, but he is a kind of he works on a railway station, and he, in his free time, creates these kind of installations. You can see it, but it's kind of hammer and sickle, and it's made kind of a church made in the form of hammer and sickle. And what was kind of problematic, I think, about the show, that he decided also to include some images. There was a huge wall dedicated to Occupy movement, which is very kind of, problematic, and he was blamed by the media that he tried to aestheticize politics, which leads, according to Benjamin, to kind of fascism, as we all know. And now I want to go to a bit different direction and talk about protest movement and this relationship between identitarian struggle for kind of personal freedoms and struggle for social justice, kind of more general struggle. I would like to quote Ekaterina Dogut, who wrote that in post-Soviet former East artistic practices, female artists and intellectuals were hesitant, if not clearly opposed, to call themselves feminist or even women. One has to understand it from the territory of communist universal claim. When defining oneself as a woman would sound reductivist and even essentialist. The same can be said about the notion of nations that we also rejected, and even class. For a long time, post-Soviet former East was maintaining and still maintaining the dream of classless society, which never existed but in dreams. So if we talk about history of feminism, it's very problematic in Russia because we used to have extremely advanced feminist movement starting in 1905 and going into socialist feminism of Alexander Kollontai in the 20s. And when Stalin said that women question is resolved, it was kind of formally explained and proclaimed that we don't have any kind of oppression and anything like that, and this kind of myth is still kind of installed in Russian mentality, and only now, I think, especially after a Pussy Riot case, people started to realize what's really going on. And what kind of problems we have. And thanks to Pussy Riot, many feminist groups in Russia got kind of publicity that started to be visible and heard. For example, there is a Moscow feminist group, and this is a protest actually against Pussy Riot, organized by Orthodox Church. So it's against Pussy Riot and against blasphemy in general. And you can see these like banners on the right. I think it's called like gun felons. So basically, all these Orthodox activists nowadays, they come to sex shops, they come to gay clubs with these kind of gun felons. And in this regard, I wanted to show one work, which may look quite naive, by one of the members of Moscow feminist group, whose name is Smart Mary, kind of pseudonym. And she made this kind of gun felon kind of in a feminist way. So I was thinking even about Irving group and this notion of over-identification with oppressor, when kind of feminists start to over-identify themselves with this crazy Orthodox priest. And actually the object was shown in an exhibition. It was censored for different reasons because it was not considered to be artistic enough. And feminists started to kind of use it as a real banner, as a real gun felon in the show, and they also use this kind of banners produced by her in the protest movements. And here it's written, feminist art against violence and domestic slavery. And now, so we have this process of like radicalization of feminism, and many feminist groups, they did not allow, for example, men to come to their meetings, they don't allow male artists to participate in the exhibitions, and some other groups that used to be radical become de-radicalized again, and they start to kind of fight with oppression in general and start to support ethnic minority workers, cleaners, and different other groups and of people. And just I want to show examples that some kind of female artists from the past, before this radicalization of feminism, who were female but never proclaimed themselves feminists because nobody actually did at the time. I mean, not so many artists. They worked also with the idea of equality of different groups. And of course, this problem is very acute now in Russia. Maybe you know about this anti-gay law that was recently passed in St. Petersburg, and then was it passed only in first reading by Duma in Moscow. That means that if they sign it 2 more times, it will pass in the whole Russia. And only now I think like Russian art community realized that we never had like queer artists, that we never had gay artists, that we never have transgender LGBT artists or whatever. And we don't have any kind of equivalent of queer theory in Russia as well. And I think the only book written on this topic is by this sexologist Igor Kohn, and he wrote like very interesting thing about it. So we have this word homosexualism with ism, and we have heterosexuality. So we don't have homosexuality like in the West. Do you understand what I mean? So in the word there is ism, and if you talk about homosexual, you call him or her homosexualist. So it always has this implication of being kind of a sect or ideology or something like that. And if you listen and read Russian media, they always kind of say that there is kind of gay mafia that exists in Russia that kind of controls everything, and they kind of lobby their interest, and that gay people, because they cannot reproduce themselves, they try to adopt children. Of course, they rape them, and then these children become gay as well. So this kind of vicious circle. And some artists, actually female artists, but not male artists, reflected on this issue. For example, this artist, Alina Gutkina, who made kind of series of Polaroid photos. It's kind of a long narrative about how gay mafia operates in Russia, how kind of they beat people, they steal their money and kind of disappear. I think the only male artist that I found who working with this issue is Nikita Zhukovsky, who made kind of fake advertising campaign about the drinks that you kind of consume, and suddenly you become kind of homosexual or something like that. So it was like made with a performance. And yeah, also I want to say there's only female artists for some reason deal with this topic, but not male artists. But also we had in the 90s a very strange group called New Academy in St. Petersburg that were making this neo-academic pictures that were very kind of homoerotic, but they never kind of called that they were kind of gay or something like that. And in this regard, I decided to steal a quotation from Ekaterina Dogis from her Facebook. I hope she will forgive me for that. So she wrote about actually this kind of artist. She was writing that she, maybe if she wants to curate something in the West about this problem, she will face with the problem that this aestheticization of otherness as a consumerist product, pleasant, unnamed with its proper name, unnamed with its proper name, and that's why acceptable until it becomes legislatively dangerous. Moreover, this commercial product is happily marked as a sign of conservatism or even reaction that is the same ideology which in the end came to one's senses and realized its homophobia that has always been ripening inside it. And I was also thinking about this artist who just died very recently. He was like quite young. I think he's like one of the most famous artists from the 90s. And he created many kind of alter egos, for example, Marilyn Monroe. And he always kind of left this interstice between his own kind of appearance and the identity that he took. So you always see the process, how it's kind of constructed. And he never also said anything like that in public about any issues relating to gay rights movement or LGBT rights movement. And recently one artist, again a female artist, who has fake new agency called Utopian Youth Agency, she published in kind of obituary after his death, kind of his testament that he never wrote. She wrote it instead of him. And this is the guy who responsible for anti-gay riot in St. Petersburg and for many other conservative laws. And she decided to make kind of collage out of Mamashев Monroe as if he was Pavel Milonov, and she wrote a text as if he wrote it, that he now kind of participate in this kind of activism, but he kind of died, and now we need to continue his fight, which is very interesting because I think it's a kind of a sign that art community realized how incapable it was all the time. And now they try to retroactively and retrospectively reconstruct the whole history of Russian art to kind of politicize it and to radicalize it only now. And another quite obvious topic that I would like briefly to introduce is also absence of any kind of post-colonial discourse in Russia. I think now we have only one theorist. Her name is Madina Tlastanova, who is not, I think, very famous. And she actually writes against post-colonialism as it's presented in the West, because post-colonial project for her is associated only, it reflects only on colonies like Britain and France, so like, for example, Britain and India, but it never properly deals with local situations. So it always imports some kind of predefined ideas and applied to other kind of contexts. And so she called her, like this project, she calls it the colonial project, and it deconstructs not only colonialism but also post-colonialism, because post-colonialism for her is based on binary oppositions. There is always a subject and there is always an object. So subject, kind of an Homi Baba, for example, who analyze a certain situation, and there is the object that he analyzes. And she tried kind of to rewrite this history in a way that there is no subject-object opposition, and she tried to kind of deconstruct the knowledge itself, how it's produced in a post-colonial discourse, because she thinks it's kind of also imported from Western philosophy. And what is more interesting is the relation to post-colonialism in Russia itself, because we actually colonized ourselves several times. So Peter the Great colonized Russia by introducing Western culture, Western politics, Western values several centuries ago. And now we had Bolsheviks who imported this discourse and socialism and all these progressive ideas from the West again. And Russia always was kind of trying to patronize small ethnic groups and other countries as if it was kind of more advanced, but actually it was always a complex that what we kind of try to, what we try as people to do is actually also kind of imported from the West, but it's not ours. Do you understand what I mean? Okay. And one, I think, of the artists who works in not post-colonial but in the colonial way is Taus Makhacheva. And this is early work, maybe not the best one. Maybe, yeah, it's a bit kind of, she's playing with Orientalism. So she was born in Moscow, but her parents are from Dagestan. It's a region in Caucasus, a very problematic one, if you may know. And she came actually to her show, to the opening in this dress, and she recorded the whole way in different types of transport in Russia. And she tried to kind of construct this identity of being our women, and our is a very small nationality in Dagestan to which she belongs. But in her more recent works, this is just a kind of picture made kind of in advertising way, advertising fashion, but actually it's a video and a performance that she did. She participated in this car that covered with furs in Dagestan, in Makhachkala, in the capital of Dagestan, in the real kind of race organized illegally in the night with all kind of masculine macho men there. So she was kind of participating with them with this race, and it's very interesting that she, when she deconstructs masculinity, she doesn't deconstruct kind of from a Western position, but she also deconstructs it from the position of being insider in this context. And I think it's the last artist that I would like to mention. It is Olga Zhitlina, the same artist who made this utopian news agency. And she also deals with oppressed minorities and oppressed ethnic groups, especially people who came to work to Moscow and St. Petersburg. She's from St. Petersburg, to find a job. Especially these people are coming from Central Asia and sometimes from Caucasus as well. And she created this game. So it's like a Monopoly or kind of table game that everybody can play. And it is based on all kind of different bureaucratic agencies that you have to go through to get a legal job in Moscow or any other big city in Russia. So she kind of gives people opportunity to play and really realize why people start to work illegally, because it's not possible for them to get a kind of legal job, actually. And thinking about this, everything that I just said, I was thinking about writing of David Harvey, and especially what he wrote about 1968, I mean the protest movement of 1968, and why it has failed. And according to him, this struggle for personal freedom that was made by student movement and struggle for more general social justice that was kind of propagated by leftist parties at the time that still had some power. They didn't manage to reconcile together, and kind of neoliberal ideology absorbed and co-opted this discourse of personal freedom into their program, and all political freedoms that could kind of come out of it was transformed into basically economical freedoms, but not political ones. And I was just thinking how I don't have any answers. How could we kind of reconcile different kind of radicalization of different groups and this kind of common struggle? I was thinking just about one work. So that wasn't the last one, sorry. That one artist just, I think, a couple of weeks ago or maybe months ago did in St. Petersburg, again in the palace, not in the palace, in the place where bureaucrats and all the people sign all this anti-gay and other kind of neoconservative laws. So basically he roped himself into this wire and lied until kind of policemen came to take him. So the idea behind this work was how like Russian government reduce kind of identity or reduce any subjectivity or any kind of person, human being, citizen, anyone into kind of just flesh, human flesh. And and I just mentioned this work because I think it encapsulates different strengths and different kind of struggles in one work, and I think it's quite powerful and understandable for different groups of people. And to conclude, I was thinking about Boris Groys's idea of weak universalism. And Boris Groys could be very reductivist, and Malevich was very reductivist in modernist way, and I decided to be a bit reductivist regarding what Boris Groys wrote. And basically, his idea was that avant-garde kind of reduces itself, for example, as you can see in a black square, that painting reduced to two colors, black and white, basically 1 and 0, a kind of binary code. And by transforming itself into kind of computer code, avant-garde can kind of protect itself from destruction, so it becomes kind of timeless, and it can reappear again, and as usually Boris Groys writes, like on the Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and so on. So I just was thinking how this emancipatory potential and this claim for universalism was realized by Russian artists like Pussy Riot recently, using like poor images and by just simply uploading it to the internet. And when we realized that kind of the main enemies that we fight against in different countries actually the same. I think these different claims for find your own identity, what Anna was talking about kulik, is not that relevant anymore, because people kind of unite in this kind of universal struggle, and art becomes very understandable for different people. So that's it.
I think it's time to turn the microphone to this side of the room. So if you have any comments and questions, you are welcome.
I was thinking with one of your first examples, Anna, about these people. But I thought about this book about the guy whose name I forgot, the one who wrote about komunałka.
Kavakov?
No, the one who's fighting with Groys in footnotes.
Pivovarov?
No, never mind. The one who
He had this list
theory about the it, right? The language of it, that it happened, that the language was impersonal, and you never pointed to anyone who did something. It's just it has happened, right? This shift to these. You actually do specify who did it or who's responsible. I don't know if there is possibility of any relationship there. But I wanted to ask about the change of language, not only artistic language, but the discourse surrounding art. For example, in Poland, with the critical art, you get lots of talk of social engagement and social utility of art. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I guess the new generation of actually art activists, they call themselves like that. They also, of course, they analyzed or they use references to these Moscow's activism, which was Smolovsky obviously was a part of, and even Rada Group. But what is interesting about it that one of the artists, his name is Anton Nikolaev. Actually, he was a member of a group Bambili, and also he also was a good friend of Vojna group. So he said something in his article. He said that nowadays artists became more politicized. If we're talking about ATI and these, or Anatoly Smolovsky, they were working with within a specific modernistic language. They were trying to maintain this autonomy, and they were trying to, by using this modernistic tradition in their own practice, they still were trying to find. So their message were not that political, even though that at that time it looked like a political. But after Pussy Riot, I'm sorry that bringing that all again, because unfortunately, this group changed everything. whether you like it or not, but it's still there. And even Vojna also was a group that changed everything and changed the not only position and the position artists within this arts and politics debate, but also I guess artists nowadays think about themselves as a political bodies, as a bodies that would actually change something, not just making a statement and, you know, not just using media and making statements, but actually change something to be a part of this whole mechanism. But using different strategies, more that are related to, not to the modernistic tradition.
No, it's interesting that you focused on this word Zeus, because as you know, in semiotics and in psychoanalysis, these words like he, she is called shifters, because it can shift from one person to another. It may be, it's interesting to look at this kind of name in this context, when it could be Zeus, guys like it, or someone else. And now artists kind of more focused on the kind of identity and the political agenda, and they wouldn't like to be called Zeus guys. They would like to be called like Pussy Riot or something like that.
So either you're right or left, you know, you're not something in between. So.
Well, my question is not about Pussy Riot, but it's about... Yeah, but you say like also Viola, like there is a change in terms of activism and art, and you said it changed everything. Also before Pussy Riots, there's a change. So can you elaborate a bit more about this? Why it changed everything, or in what way it changed everything?
You mean change in art and activism?
Yeah, because now you said you said about the I guess you were referring to the art scene, that it changed something very substantial in the art scene, and I wonder like what is cause from both sides, from the art activists, that I guess now there is much more, but also like what was the reaction within the art field?
You mean the change? Sorry. Do you mean change after the Pussy Riot, or the change happened before?
Yeah, because I know that, and also what Anna said now, that it was even before the Pussy Riots, also Viola already made some change. So Pussy Riots is kind of a symptom of a bigger process that's going on.
Yeah, it's true. We just didn't, just had very kind of big jump from the 90s into the protest movement. But there were a lot of change going on in that time. For example, I think you curated the works, Что делать group, What is to be done. They were organized in 2002, so they were probably the first kind of explicitly leftist group that's trying to kind of produce leftist discourse in Russia. And also we had so it's very long genealogy. It kind of goes from Moscow actionism to Pussy Riot and further. And this line after Moscow actionism that you see in Anna's presentation, there was so-called artivism, so something between activism and artivism, or in other terms it was called cognitive terrorism, because it was used rhetorics of like party and rhetorics of official politics, but it was functioning as a kind of terrorism, and not even they wanted it to be to terrorism, but then our government reacted to it, kind of, oh my God, what's happened? They put this banner in the street. So yeah, it's kind of a long line. And there were many factors that kind of stimulated and politicized Russian art production. But yes, after the protest movement, it was like very kind of significant break with what was happening before.
sorry, just to take that further, do you think that, I mean, Pussy Riot also happened in, in a context where you have revolutions, right? So you have Arab Spring, you have Occupy movement, you have groups like Femin, and you have other groups that are using this as a strategy, activism or intervention, etc. So do you think that, I mean, while you're talking about a particularly Russian context, but do you think that context was speaking to or was in conversation with other regional and international contexts?
Yeah, well, I guess if we're talking, well, not going back to, but yeah, even Vojna, they were trying to find a way, well, not to, I guess they were trying to find a common language and to be heard outside the country. And but some experts perceive it as a, well, not a coward way, but using this new way of communication, like, internet, and just uploading videos and doing interventions and screaming outside and saying that, what is happening here, like what is happening in the country and how we suffer from this cruel political regime. So, I mean, that's why Vojna at some point received huge criticism for the first years of their practices. But even Pussy Riot at the beginning, especially with that performance that they did at the church, also received a huge amount of criticism, because it was, some people actually found it offensive, but also because it was, they were using the same strategy as Vojna. So yeah, on the one hand, since you're living in such a complicated, well, we're living in such a complicated context, and and trying to find this, establish the dialogue between East and West, if you could say that. It has its own positive and negative aspects, and in case of Vojna and Pussy Riot, even in our community, some experts or some actually artists found it really hypocrite, because they're also using Western strategies, like in terms of public interventions, but in a way they're not really sincere. They're not really participating. So they're just creating this media noise, public awareness, but actually it doesn't work. It doesn't change much. It's actually everything is getting even worse right now. Because of Pussy Riot, now we're having this. Now in Parliament, they're thinking about passing a law that would, if you hurt someone's religious feelings, you would get in jail for that. So actually, they're trying to pass laws that would even make the whole system even more rough and even more. Even more. I don't know how to put it. Even more complicated to live in. So, all those media, I would say, activism. It has its in the Russian context. Most of the time, it has this negative reactions.
I would disagree, because I think they would pass these laws anyway, but it just would go not that feasible and just more smoothly. And now they kind of react to it, and it's become more visible what they do. And Orthodox Church also realized that feminism is dangerous, and like Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Orthodox Church, recently said, I think maybe in March, at the Congress that feminism is very dangerous. He said it like that because if a woman wouldn't work inside family while husband works outside family earning money, the whole society will kind of collapse, and we wouldn't have this very moral and ethical nation that we used to have. Yeah, maybe it's not. Was it a kind of answer to your question?
The other thing is you mentioned post-colonialism, right? And so, I mean, coming from a post-colonial context, I find that, colonialism had a lot to do with building empire, right? And how do you, and the administration of that empire. And I wonder that the critique of post-colonialism that you were referring to, you mentioned that we occupied or we colonized ourselves, and someone who lives in a post-colonial context can understand that. But I wonder, in terms of the economics of this colonization, has the artist that you mentioned talked about that, or is that even a point of analysis and exploration for artists who work with this idea or this issue?
Sorry, you ask about artists.
I don't know, I forget the name of the artist.
Yeah, Taos Makhacheva, for example.
So,
you mean if she's doing research, or?
Yeah, in the sense that, it's very easy to say post-colonial, right? But for me, one of the biggest issues of post-colonialism was revolved around the building of empire. And that is something that when you talk about post-colonial or you talk about colonization, that is a central issue that, for me at least, you cannot navigate without even addressing or touching or referring to or deconstructing whatever.
So you mean that in her works she doesn't deal with the problem of building the empire itself? Yeah, no, I think she doesn't, and she's very subtle. She's very subtle in what she's doing. She always kind of leaves room for thought and room for interpretation. So I think when I make works, I try to be very clear, and I use a lot of language to express precisely what I want to say. And she's kind of the opposite of this. And I think it's more about what this theorist called aesthesis, like this sensorium understanding of these relationships and how we can deconstruct our senses and our knowledge of this relationship, if I understand it correctly. Does it make any sense? Yeah.
The question that I would like to ask is very simple and naive. We were talking about Moscow all the time.
Not only. Okay. I was talking about St. Petersburg and Moscow, but we were not talking about the regions.
Yeah, because it's another huge question, and we won't be able to cover it within this presentation. It's impossible.
No, I don't mean that you should have covered all huge area, but I was just thinking how this perception of self-perception of artistic community is connected with the centralized perspective also, where the art comes from. How much it is, how relevant for us, for example, would be to just browse some other places, just for reference, or you think that in this way, by looking at what is going on with the Moscow community, artistic community, we can learn most relevant thing? It's a naive question because I know that it's such a huge issue area and such diverse culture at the end of the day that you cannot ask about one Russia or whatever. But I'm also curious how you deal with this very fact that you kind of cannot grasp it or have this particular perspective.
Well, I can say that one of the person that is really developing cultural regional politics is Marat Gelman, and one of his achievements is Museum of Modern Art in Perm, which is not really far from Moscow. But so his ambition was to create another cultural capital from the beginning. And judging from his interviews and judging from his experience, he said something like that, of course, when he came to Perm for the first time, the local community totally rejected him because he came from the capital, and he was, that's the other thing. I don't want to use word provincial, but still, the relationship between capital and regional cities is really complicated because in this case, even economically, Russia is very centralized. So everything goes to Moscow. Moscow benefits from everything, even culturally. So everyone actually hates us for that. So yeah, even though that now he's one of the main specialists in regional politics and especially regarding cultural production, as far as I know, that project with the Perm Museum was a success anyway, even though that now the government of that region has changed and another person came who didn't actually, and he actually doesn't like Gelman, but Gelman managed to find a dialogue with him, and now I guess they're not going to shut down the Perm project. As for other cities like Yekaterinburg, of course, there is Yekaterinburg, Nizhny Novgorod, and what else? There is another city. Sorry? Yeah, Kaliningrad maybe. So all those cities, they have NCCA franchise. But if you go actually to those cities and see in what condition all those institutions are now, it's horrible. Like, for instance, in Nizhny Novgorod, they have like a super tiny space for working space and really tiny space for exhibition program. So, I mean, when you're in Moscow, of course, everything looks cool, but when you actually go to those places and visit those cities, you realize that everything is not that optimistic as it seems. And
this guy Gelman, he is not kind of he doesn't have any foundation. It's now only I think he started, but actually he has a private gallery, so he has his own taste, and he imposes his own taste everywhere in all the cities that he comes. So when people sometimes ask him to leave the city, not to make the exhibitions here anymore because they don't like it. So it usually doesn't go from below. It comes from above. And also we have, the only good thing we have is industrial biennial in Yekaterinburg, which is I think good. I've never been there, but it sounds promising.
I wanted to ask you again about the political context and aspect of the recent developments, because you mentioned the workers' union, and it appears to me that there are two strands when it comes to politicization. So one is more introvert, as an artist, are looking at their own working conditions and then the precarity of the artistic and cultural labor. And on the other hand, there seems to be more direct political involvement. And I was wondering whether you see those two currents as part of one thing, or is it, do they appear to develop different problems and different practices?
I think I have a kind of answer maybe to this question. This artist who made this Museum of Proletarian Culture, he is kind of one of them, kind of a star in the Russian art scene, and maybe he doesn't known at all in the Western context, global context. And he had a kind of some photo shoots in kind of fashion magazines, wearing kind of Prada dresses with red flags, because his idea is, if I'm not mistaken, that our hipster websites like Look at Me, they have potentially a socialist program. And if you try to politicize hipsters through kind of making kind of attractive view for protest movement and for leftist discourse, they would kind of join the club.
It's basically working on a strategy that hipsters are part of cultural revolution?
They potential, like, if I'm not mistaken, according to him, they have kind of a potential to become kind of revolutionaries, socialist, etc., etc.
I was thinking, if I may, I was thinking about the context of the sort of critical look at the institutions and art institutions and artistic labor. Do you think it can be seen as paradigmatic for the rest of society? So the sort of deconstructing and criticizing those methods of working and existence can be shifted to other parts of societies, and I don't know, factory works or whatever.
It's quite ambitious. But what May Congress of Cultural Workers does, they usually they're trying to find it's their own niche in this case, because the needs of cultural workers here are prioritized, and of course it's quite a small initiative for doing what you're what you mentioned in your question, because I know that some of them, they were trying to Arseny Zhelaev also, he was delved himself in one of his projects. He delved himself into this factory workers environment, and he was kind of trying to explore their modes of, not modes of thinking, but how they actually.
I think he just wanted to help people who create Moscow Biennale, and he worked with the workers together, hanging like expensive paintings and so on.
Yeah, but the idea, the romantic idea of the project was to explore how those in what conditions those workers are living, and be a part of sort of their community. But I guess the problem is that they couldn't establish any, they couldn't find any common ground. They couldn't find any gray zone in which their needs and their ideas would coincide or work together in the same way. So I don't know, potentially maybe, but not now, not in the next maybe even 5 years, because especially.
Whether artists have this ambition or thinking that this sort of shift is possible?
There is an ambition, but I don't know if it's going to work or. I have no. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I kind of doubt it. But it's not my judgment, you know. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, I think that maybe there is a potential, but.
Just a small comment. Just one of them, our critic who co-organized this initiative for May Congress, she told me that after she participated in this trade union, she didn't manage to find any job at all because, oh, this is Maria from this trade union. No, we don't want her in our institution. So.
So, if I propose right now to thank our speakers for today, formally and informally we can continue. So, thank you very much for the inspiration and for the great kickoff actually for our further discussions. So, thank you.
Thank you.